The Kansas summer sun beat down mercilessly on the small homestead that Emma Wright had been trying to maintain alone for the past 6 months. At 12 years old, she was far too young to be living without adult supervision, but the fever that had taken her parents last winter had left her with few choices. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, and the authorities in town had made vague promises about finding relatives or arranging proper care, but nothing had materialized. So Emma had simply continued living in the only home she had ever known, tending the small garden, caring for the 3 chickens that remained, and rationing the supplies that dwindled with each passing week. The well behind the cabin was Emma's lifeline, providing the clean water that made survival possible in this harsh landscape. It was a deep stone structure that her father had spent 2 summers building, carefully lining the shaft with rocks he had hauled from a creek bed 3 miles away. Emma approached it several times each day with her wooden bucket, the rope worn smooth from countless trips up and down the dark shaft. She had learned to be careful near the well's edge, remembering her mother's constant warnings about the danger of falling into that deep, cold darkness where help would never come. On this particular afternoon, as Emma lowered her bucket and listened for the splash that would tell her it had reached water, she heard something that made her freeze. It was a sound that did not belong, a human voice, weak and desperate, calling out words she could not understand. Emma's first thought was that exhaustion and loneliness were playing tricks on her mind, that months of isolation had finally driven her to hearing things that were not real. But the voice came again, clearer this time, definitely human and definitely coming from inside the well. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she leaned over the stone edge and called down into the darkness. The voice responded immediately, stronger now, speaking rapidly in a language that sounded like nothing Emma had ever heard. She ran to the cabin and grabbed the oil lamp her father had used for reading, lit it with trembling hands, and returned to the well. Leaning over as far as she dared, Emma lowered the lamp on a rope and peered into the shaft. What she saw in the flickering light made her gasp and pull back in shock. At the bottom of the well, perhaps 20 feet down, a young man sat in the shallow water that pooled at the base. He was clearly Native American, dressed in traditional clothing that was now torn and muddy, his long dark hair matted with dirt and blood. One of his legs was bent at an awkward angle, obviously broken or badly injured, and his face was bruised and swollen. When the lamplight reached him, he looked up with eyes that showed both hope and fear, raising one hand to shield his face from the sudden brightness, while reaching toward her with the other, his voice growing more urgent in its incomprehensible pleas. Emma pulled back from the well's edge, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts and emotions. She had been raised on stories about Indian raids and frontier dangers, taught to fear the native peoples, who her parents said resented settlers taking their land. But the man trapped in her well was not a frightening warrior preparing for battle. He was a hurt, desperate human being begging for help in a situation where he was completely powerless. Emma thought about how it would feel to be trapped in that cold, dark hole, injured and alone, slowly losing hope as hours turned to days with no rescue coming. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Emma called down to the man in her well, trying to communicate through tone if not through words that she would help him. She ran back to the cabin and gathered supplies, rope, blankets, the remaining bread she had baked 2 days ago, and a jar of water. Returning to the well, she carefully lowered these items, watching as the man below grabbed them with desperate gratitude. He drank deeply from the water jar, then looked up at her and spoke again, this time with less fear and more something that might have been hope or even trust. Over the next hour, Emma tried to assess the situation and figure out what to do next. The man was too injured to climb out on his own, even with a rope to help him. His broken leg made it impossible for him to put weight on it, and his weakened condition suggested he had been down there for at least a day, possibly longer. Emma would need help to rescue him, but getting help meant involving adults who would ask questions, make decisions, and possibly turn the situation into something dangerous for both of them. She knew that captured Native Americans were sometimes treated as prisoners or worse, and she suspected that this man had not ended up in her well by accident. As the afternoon wore on, and Emma sat by the well, trying to communicate with her unexpected discovery, she pieced together fragments of his story through gestures and the few English words he seemed to know. His name sounded like Tokala, though Emma was not sure she was pronouncing it correctly. He had been captured by what Emma understood to be bounty hunters, men who made money bringing in Native Americans, dead or alive. They had thrown him down the well, apparently intending to return later to retrieve his body and collect their reward, not knowing or caring that the well provided water to an orphaned girl who depended on it for survival. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Emma made her second important decision of the day. She could not leave Tokala trapped in the well overnight, could not bear the thought of him spending another cold, dark night in that hole, wondering if death would come from his injuries, from thirst, or from the men who had thrown him down there returning to finish what they started. But she also could not rescue him alone. She needed help, but it had to be the right kind of help. Someone who would see a human being needing rescue rather than a prize to be claimed or a problem to be eliminated. Emma thought about her options. The sheriff in town was not known for his compassion toward Native Americans. Most of the neighboring homesteaders shared her late parents' fearful attitudes and would likely see Tokala as a threat rather than someone in need. But there was one person who might help, an elderly woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who lived 3 miles to the west and who had always been kind to Emma, bringing food and checking on her occasionally since her parents died. Mrs. Fletcher had once mentioned that she had lived among the Lakota years ago, before the major conflicts, and had learned their language. It was a slim hope, but it was all Emma had. As darkness fell, Emma made Tokala as comfortable as she could, lowering more blankets and all the food she could spare. She promised him through gestures that she would return with help, praying that he understood, and that she would not arrive back to find the bounty hunters had returned first. Then Emma set out walking through the prairie darkness toward Mrs. Fletcher's homestead, guided by starlight and desperate hope, carrying with her the weight of one impossible choice and the beginning of a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, compassion, and the complicated truths of the frontier. The 3-mile walk to Mrs. Fletcher's homestead felt like 30 in the darkness, with every sound in the prairie night making Emma jump and imagine bounty hunters, or worse, lurking in the tall grass. Her legs ached, and her lungs burned by the time she saw the warm glow of lamplight in Mrs. Fletcher's window. Emma stumbled up to the door and knocked frantically, her fist pounding against the weathered wood with desperate urgency. When the door opened and Mrs. Fletcher's concerned face appeared, Emma nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Fletcher was a woman, in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen enough of life to understand that the world was rarely as simple as people wanted it to be. She took one look at Emma's exhausted, frightened face and pulled the girl inside without questions, settling her into a chair and pressing a cup of water into her trembling hands. Only after Emma had caught her breath did Mrs. Fletcher ask what had brought her running through the night, and Emma poured out the entire story in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in their urgency to be heard. Mrs. Fletcher listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Emma finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and complications of what the girl was asking. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was both gentle and firm, explaining that what Emma proposed was dangerous not just physically but legally and socially. Helping a Native American prisoner escape could bring consequences that would destroy what little security Emma still had, potentially landing her in an orphanage or worse. But Mrs. Fletcher also acknowledged that leaving a human being to die in a well was not something either of them could live with. Mrs. Fletcher made her decision quickly once she had considered all angles. She gathered rope, medical supplies, and food, then hitched her horse to a small wagon. She told Emma that they would rescue Tokala, but they would have to do it carefully and quietly. Mrs. Fletcher had indeed lived among the Lakota years ago when her first husband traded with various tribes, and she had learned not only their language, but also their ways of healing and their codes of honor. She believed that if they saved Tokala's life, there might be a path forward that did not end in tragedy for anyone involved, but it would require trust and courage from all parties. The journey back to Emma's homestead seemed to take forever, though it was actually less than an hour. Mrs. Fletcher drove the wagon while Emma sat beside her, anxiously watching the horizon for any signs of the bounty hunters returning. When they finally arrived, Emma ran immediately to the well and called down to Tokala, relieved beyond measure when his voice answered from below. Mrs. Fletcher approached more slowly, speaking in Lakota as she leaned over the well's edge, and Emma heard the surprise and hope in Tokala's response when he realized someone could understand him. Mrs. Fletcher translated as Tokala explained his situation in more detail. He was a scout for a small Lakota band that was trying to reach their designated territory peacefully, avoiding conflict with settlers and soldiers. 3 days ago, he had been captured by bounty hunters while tracking game to feed his people. The hunters had beaten him, broken his leg deliberately to prevent escape, and thrown him down the first well they found, planning to return later to claim his body for the bounty that was paid for captured Native Americans, regardless of whether they arrived alive or dead. The rescue operation took careful planning and considerable effort. Mrs. Fletcher was strong for her age, but neither she nor Emma had the strength to simply haul Tokala up with a rope. Instead, Mrs. Fletcher fashioned a harness from her strongest rope and attached it to her horse, creating a pulley system that would use the animal's strength to lift the injured man. Emma descended partway down the well, using footholds her father had carved into the stone, carrying the harness and helping Tokala secure it around his body, despite his injury and the awkward, confined space. The actual lifting was tense and difficult, with Emma guiding from below while Mrs. Fletcher controlled the horse above. Tokala gasped in pain as the harness tightened, and his broken leg bumped against the stone walls, but he remained as still as possible to avoid complicating the rescue. Inch by painful inch, he rose through the darkness toward the circle of starlight above. When he finally emerged at the top, Emma scrambling up behind him, both Mrs. Fletcher and Emma worked together to lift him clear of the well's edge and lay him gently on the ground. In the lamplight, Tokala's injuries were clearly visible and worse than Emma had realized from her limited view down the well. Besides the broken leg, he had deep bruises, cuts that had become infected, and showed signs of dehydration and fever. Mrs. Fletcher examined him with practiced hands, speaking softly in Lakota while she worked, explaining what she was doing and asking questions about his pain and symptoms. Tokala responded with obvious trust, perhaps sensing that this older woman understood his culture and would treat him with the dignity that the bounty hunters had denied. Mrs. Fletcher announced that Tokala could not be moved far in his current condition, that attempting to transport him in the wagon over rough prairie terrain could worsen his injuries or even prove fatal. He needed immediate medical treatment, rest, and time for his body to begin healing before any decisions could be made about what came next. She looked at Emma seriously and asked if the girl was prepared for what this meant. Tokala would need to stay at the homestead, hidden from any passing travelers or authorities, while he recovered enough to either return to his people or face whatever fate awaited him if he was discovered. Emma did not hesitate in her answer. She had already committed herself to saving Tokala when she ran for help, and she would see that commitment through regardless of the risks. Together, Emma and Mrs. Fletcher carried Tokala into the cabin and settled him on Emma's own bed, the only real furniture in the small house besides a table and 2 chairs. Mrs. Fletcher cleaned and dressed his wounds, set his broken leg with practiced skill, and prepared medicines from herbs she carried in her supplies. She explained each step to Emma, teaching the girl how to care for their patient so she could manage during the days when Mrs. Fletcher could not be present without raising suspicions about her frequent absences. As dawn began to break over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mrs. Fletcher prepared to leave. She told Emma that she would return as often as possible with food, medicine, and supplies, but that Emma would need to be extremely careful about keeping Tokala's presence secret. If the bounty hunters returned, if neighbors came calling, or if anyone asked questions, Emma would need to have believable answers ready. The older woman also warned that this arrangement could only be temporary, that eventually they would need to find a permanent solution that ensured both Tokala's safety and Emma's well-being. Before departing, Mrs. Fletcher spoke at length with Tokala in his own language, and though Emma could not understand the words, she could see the emotion in both their faces. Later, Mrs. Fletcher translated the essence of their conversation. Tokala had sworn on his honor that he would bring no harm to Emma, that he recognized the extraordinary courage and kindness she had shown in rescuing him, and that he would find a way to repay this debt and ensure her safety. Mrs. Fletcher had told him about Emma's situation, her orphaned status and precarious survival on the homestead, and Tokala had been moved by the realization that his rescuer was herself vulnerable and in need of protection. As Mrs. Fletcher's wagon disappeared into the morning light, Emma returned to her cabin and looked at the wounded warrior sleeping in her bed. She thought about how much her life had changed in just 24 hours, how a simple trip to draw water had led to this impossible situation, where she was now harboring a fugitive and risking everything on the belief that saving a life mattered more than following rules that seemed designed to treat people as less than human. Emma was frightened, exhausted, and uncertain about what would come next, but she was also certain that she had made the right choice. Whatever consequences followed, she would face them knowing she had acted with courage and compassion, and that was worth more than the safety that came from looking away when someone needed help. The days that followed the rescue established a rhythm that was strange, challenging, and surprisingly meaningful for both Emma and Tokala. The language barrier made communication difficult at first, but necessity proved to be an excellent teacher. Emma learned Lakota words for pain, water, food, and thank you, while Tokala's English improved rapidly, as he had nothing to do but listen and practice while confined to bed recovering from his injuries. Mrs. Fletcher visited every few days, bringing supplies and serving as translator for more complex conversations, but increasingly Emma and Tokala found ways to understand each other through gestures, simple words, and the universal languages of kindness and humor. Tokala proved to be a patient and uncomplaining patient. Despite the considerable pain his injuries caused, he followed Mrs. Fletcher's instructions carefully, taking the herbal medicines she prepared even when they tasted bitter, remaining still, when movement might damage his healing leg, and accepting his helpless dependence on a 12-year-old girl with a grace that impressed both Emma and Mrs. Fletcher. He seemed to understand that his survival depended entirely on Emma's courage and Mrs. Fletcher's knowledge, and he treated both women with a respect that went beyond mere gratitude into something approaching reverence. As Tokala's fever subsided and his wounds began to heal, he started contributing to the household in whatever ways his limited mobility allowed. He taught Emma how to weave stronger rope from prairie grass, showed her techniques for preserving food that would last through winter, and shared knowledge about plants that could be used for medicine or nutrition. Emma was surprised by how much Tokala knew about practical survival, skills that her parents had never taught her, and that proved invaluable for someone trying to maintain a homestead alone. The student became teacher, and Emma found herself learning more in these weeks than she had in months of struggling alone. But the healing was not just physical. Emma began to understand through their halting conversations and Mrs. Fletcher's translations that Tokala carried wounds deeper than broken bones. He spoke of his family, a wife and young son who were traveling with his band toward the reservation, and his desperate worry about what had happened to them when he disappeared. He described the fear and uncertainty of trying to live peacefully while being hunted like animals, the impossibility of maintaining dignity and culture while being forced into smaller and smaller territories, and the grief of watching a way of life disappear despite doing everything asked by authorities who kept changing the rules. Emma listened to these stories with growing understanding and shame. She had believed the simple narratives she had been taught, that Native Americans were dangerous savages who needed to be civilized or removed for everyone's safety. But Tokala was none of those things. He was a husband worried about his wife, a father desperate to protect his son, a person trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to give him no viable options. Emma realized that the real story was far more complicated and far more tragic than she had ever imagined, and that the people she had been taught to fear were actually people just like her, wanting nothing more than to live in peace and take care of their families. 3 weeks after the rescue, Tokala was finally able to stand with the help of a crutch that Emma and Mrs. Fletcher had fashioned from a sturdy branch. His leg was healing well, though it would be months before he could walk normally or run as he once had. Mrs. Fletcher declared him well enough to travel, and the time had come to make decisions about what would happen next. Tokala could not simply stay hidden in Emma's cabin forever. Eventually, someone would discover him or the bounty hunters would return, and either scenario would bring danger for everyone involved. Mrs. Fletcher proposed a plan that was risky, but offered the best chance for a positive outcome. She had contacts among the Quaker communities in eastern Kansas, religious groups that opposed the violent treatment of Native Americans and who ran stations that helped people reach safety. If they could transport Tokala to one of these stations, the Quakers could help reunite him with his band and ensure he received safe passage to the reservation where his family would be waiting. The journey would be dangerous, requiring them to travel through territory where Tokala would be recognized and captured if spotted, but it was their best option for ensuring his safety and Emma's. Before they could execute this plan, the situation changed dramatically. Emma was working in her garden one afternoon while Tokala rested inside the cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized the two riders coming toward her homestead, rough-looking men with guns prominently displayed and expressions that suggested they were not making a friendly visit. Emma realized immediately that these were the bounty hunters who had thrown Tokala down the well, returning to retrieve what they considered their property. Emma forced herself to remain calm as the men dismounted and approached her, their eyes scanning the property with the practiced assessment of predators, evaluating potential threats. The taller of the two, a man with a scar across his cheek and cold eyes, asked Emma if she had seen any Indians in the area, explaining that they had captured one a few weeks back and lost track of him near here. Emma met his gaze steadily and said she had seen no one, that she lived alone and rarely had visitors. The man seemed skeptical, noting that it was unusual for a child to be living without supervision, and asked if he and his partner could look around. Emma knew that allowing them to search would mean discovering Tokala and likely would result in violence that she was powerless to prevent. She also knew that refusing would raise immediate suspicion, so she made a split-second decision that was either brilliant or foolish. She told them they were welcome to look, but warned that she had been sick with fever for the past 2 weeks, and that anyone entering her cabin risked catching whatever illness had been making her vomit and shake with chills. She coughed dramatically for effect, noting with satisfaction when both men took an involuntary step backward. The men hesitated, clearly torn between their desire to search and their fear of disease. The shorter hunter, who seemed marginally less cruel than his partner, suggested they check the well since that was where they had left their captive. Emma's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to nod and lead them to the well, praying silently that they would not notice any evidence of the rescue. The men peered down into the darkness, and the taller one swore viciously when he saw that the well was empty except for water. He turned on Emma suspiciously, demanding to know what had happened to the man they had left there. Emma responded with a carefully constructed lie, saying she had found the well contaminated about 3 weeks ago, that the water had tasted wrong, and she had seen something dead floating in it. She claimed she had been using the creek for water since then, and had not looked down the well closely enough to see a person. The explanation was barely plausible, but the men seemed to accept it, perhaps because they could not imagine a 12-year-old girl successfully rescuing a grown man from a deep well. They warned Emma that the Indian they were hunting was dangerous, that if she saw any sign of him, she should report it immediately to the sheriff, and then they rode off muttering about wasted time and lost bounties. Emma waited until they were completely out of sight before running back to the cabin, her hands shaking with delayed reaction to the close call. Inside, she found Tokala sitting against the wall, his makeshift crutch beside him, and a heavy iron pan in his hand, clearly prepared to defend Emma if the hunters had entered, despite her warnings about illness. When Emma told him the men were gone, Tokala sagged with relief, but also with obvious concern. He spoke urgently in Lakota, and though Emma could not understand all the words, the meaning was clear. His presence here was putting her in danger, and they needed to act quickly to get him to safety before the hunters returned or spread word that led others to investigate. That evening, Mrs. Fletcher arrived for one of her regular visits, and Emma immediately told her about the encounter with the bounty hunters. The older woman's face grew pale with worry, and she declared that they could not wait any longer to move Tokala to the Quaker station. Despite his still healing leg, despite the risks of travel, Staying at Emma's homestead had become too dangerous for everyone. Mrs. Fletcher announced that they would leave the following night, traveling under cover of darkness to minimize the chance of discovery, and that Emma would come with them. The girl could not stay at the homestead alone, not now that attention had been drawn to the property, and Mrs. Fletcher had already been planning to take Emma in before winter arrived anyway. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. They would travel at night when visibility was poor, and most people were asleep, using back trails that Mrs. Fletcher knew from her years of living in the territory. Tokala would lie hidden under blankets and supplies in the wagon bed, while Emma and Mrs. Fletcher would appear to be simply traveling between homesteads as women sometimes did for visits or trading. If stopped, they would claim to be heading to Mrs. Fletcher's sister's place, a fiction that would be difficult to disprove and would hopefully discourage detailed questioning. The entire journey would take 2 nights with 1 full day of hiding, covering about 60 miles to reach the Quaker station that Mrs. Fletcher knew was still operating. They departed Emma's homestead just after sunset, with Emma taking one last look at the cabin that had been her entire world since birth. She carried only a small bundle of possessions, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and a few items of clothing. Everything else would be left behind, and Emma felt the weight of that abandonment like a physical pressure on her chest. But she also felt relief at finally leaving the isolation and constant struggle of maintaining the homestead alone, and excitement about whatever future might await beyond the limited horizon she had always known. Tokala was in considerable pain as they settled him into the wagon bed, his healing leg protesting the movement and the cramped position he would need to maintain for hours. But he bore it with stoic silence, understanding that any sound could betray their presence if they encountered other travelers. Mrs. Fletcher had prepared a space between crates and bags that provided some cushioning, while also creating concealment, and she had brought extra blankets to cover him completely. Once Tokala was positioned and hidden, the wagon looked like nothing more than an elderly woman and a young girl transporting household goods, exactly the innocent appearance they needed to project. The first night passed without major incident, though every sound made Emma's heart race with fear. They saw distant lights from other homesteads, but encountered no one on the narrow trails Mrs. Fletcher navigated with practiced confidence. The older woman seemed to know every landmark even in darkness, guiding the horse around obstacles and choosing paths that offered maximum cover from observation. She explained quietly to Emma that she had traveled these routes many times in her younger years, back when her first husband traded with various tribes, and she had learned to move through the territory as much by feel as by sight. As dawn approached, they reached a dense grove of cottonwood trees near a creek, the hiding place Mrs. Fletcher had planned for their daylight rest. They unhitched the horse and allowed it to graze and drink, while they helped Tokala climb painfully from the wagon. His leg had stiffened during the hours of immobility, and both Emma and Mrs. Fletcher had to support him as he hobbled to a sheltered spot where he could rest more comfortably. Mrs. Fletcher prepared cold food, not daring to light a fire that might draw attention, and they ate in whispered conversation, keeping watch on the surrounding prairie for any signs of approaching riders. The day seemed to last forever, with all 3 of them confined to the small grove, unable to move freely or make noise that might carry across the open land. Tokala slept fitfully, his body still recovering from injuries and now stressed by travel. Emma dozed occasionally, but mostly stayed alert, watching and listening with the hyper-awareness that comes from knowing that discovery would mean catastrophe. Mrs. Fletcher took the first watch, then woke Emma to take over while she rested, treating the girl as a capable partner rather than a child who needed protection, a respect that Emma found both frightening and empowering. In the afternoon, their careful hiding was put to the test when a group of riders passed within a quarter mile of their position. Emma held her breath and placed a gentle hand over Tokala's mouth, signaling for absolute silence as the voices of men carried across the prairie. She could not make out specific words, but the tone suggested these were not friendly travelers. The riders paused not far from the grove, and Emma's heart nearly stopped when one of them seemed to look directly toward their hiding place. But after a tense minute that felt like an hour, the group continued on their way, never suspecting that the trees concealed 3 fugitives who were collectively holding their breath in desperate hope. When the riders were finally out of sight and earshot, all three released sighs of relief so profound they were almost prayers. Mrs. Fletcher whispered that they had been lucky, that the next night's travel would be even more dangerous, because they would be approaching more populated areas near the Quaker station. The friends who ran the station were good people, committed to helping. But getting to them meant passing through territory where their wagon might be noticed and questioned by people less sympathetic to their mission. As darkness fell again, and they prepared to resume their journey, Tokala spoke seriously to Mrs. Fletcher in Lakota, and she translated for Emma. He said that he understood the tremendous risk both women were taking for him, that his people had a saying about debts that could never fully be repaid, and that if they successfully reached the station and he was reunited with his family, he would make certain that Emma and Mrs. Fletcher were always considered friends and protectors by his band. It was more than just words of gratitude. It was a formal promise that carried weight and meaning in his culture, a bond that would extend beyond this single act of rescue to create lasting connection and mutual obligation. The second night's travel was indeed more nerve-wracking than the first. They passed closer to settlements and even had to briefly travel on a more established road, where encountering other late-night travelers was a real possibility. Twice they saw distant campfires and had to detour around them, adding miles to their journey but avoiding potential confrontations. Emma drove the wagon for several hours, giving Mrs. Fletcher a chance to rest, and she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration at being trusted with such responsibility. Behind her, hidden under blankets, Tokala remained perfectly still, despite what must have been considerable discomfort from his injured leg. Just before dawn, as exhaustion was making all of them careless and desperate to reach their destination, they encountered the danger they had been dreading. A man on horseback appeared suddenly from a side trail, calling out to them to stop. Mrs. Fletcher complied, her face calm despite the fear Emma could see in her eyes, and the rider approached to ask their business, traveling at such an unusual hour. Mrs. Fletcher spun her prepared story about visiting her sister, who had taken ill, and the man seemed to accept the explanation until his horse, catching some scent or sound from the wagon bed, became agitated and nickered nervously. The rider's expression changed to suspicion, and he demanded to know what they were carrying that would upset his horse. Mrs. Fletcher said it was just household goods, and perhaps the smell of the medicinal herbs she was bringing to her sister. But the man was not satisfied. He dismounted and walked toward the back of the wagon, clearly intending to look under the blankets. Emma's mind raced frantically for some way to stop him, and in desperation, she cried out that they were transporting her mother's body to the family burial plot, that she had died of fever, and they needed to bury her quickly before disease could spread. The lie worked better than Emma could have hoped. The man stopped immediately, his face showing the universal fear of contagion that made people of that era reluctant to approach the dead, especially those who had died of fever. He backed away from the wagon, offered brief condolences, and told them to move along quickly and bury the body with proper haste. As he rode off, Emma felt her entire body shaking with the release of tension, and she heard Mrs. Fletcher whisper a quiet prayer of thanks for the girls' quick thinking that had saved them from discovery. They reached the Quaker station just as the sun was rising, a simple farmhouse that looked unremarkable from the outside, but which Mrs. Fletcher explained had hidden rooms and secret passages designed specifically for sheltering people who needed protection from unjust laws. A couple in their 50s, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, emerged to greet them with calm warmth that suggested they had done this many times before. They quickly helped Tokala from the wagon and into the house, their practiced efficiency speaking to their experience with similar situations. Once inside, Mrs. Patterson examined Tokala's injuries with gentle competence, praising Mrs. Fletcher's treatment and declaring that the leg was healing well despite the stress of travel. Mr. Patterson spoke fluent Lakota, and he spent a long time in conversation with Tokala, gathering information about his band's location and making plans for safe reunion. He explained to Mrs. Fletcher and Emma that Tokala's family had indeed reached the reservation and had been desperately searching for him, fearing the worst when he disappeared. Mr. Patterson had contacts who could get word to them that Tokala was alive and safe, and he would arrange transport, that would reunite him with his wife and son within a week. The week Emma and Mrs. Fletcher spent at the Quaker station, waiting for Tokala's reunion with his family, became a turning point in Emma's understanding of the world and her place in it. The Pattersons' home was unlike anything she had experienced, a place where people from different backgrounds gathered in mutual respect and worked together toward the common goal of justice and compassion. Emma met other travelers passing through the station, some fleeing persecution, others carrying messages or supplies to communities in need, all united by the belief that human dignity mattered more than the prejudices and policies that sought to diminish it. Tokala's physical healing continued under Mrs. Patterson's care, but Emma noticed that his emotional transformation was equally significant. The desperate, frightened man she had pulled from the well had been replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet dignity and growing hope. He spent hours in conversation with Mr. Patterson, learning about the network of friends and sympathizers who worked to help Native American communities navigate the impossible situations created by conflicting government policies. Tokala seemed to find comfort in knowing that not all white settlers viewed his people as enemies, that there were those who recognized the injustices being committed and who risked their own safety to provide help. Mrs. Fletcher used this time to have serious conversations with Emma about the girl's future. The homestead Emma had been trying to maintain alone was not viable long-term, and returning there would mean isolation, hardship, and constant vulnerability. Mrs. Fletcher formally offered to take Emma in as a ward, providing her with a home education and the family structure that every child deserved. Emma was moved by the offer and accepted with gratitude that came from the heart. Recognizing that this woman had already proven herself to be more than just a neighbor, she had become the grandmother Emma had never known. But Emma also wanted to understand more about the broader situation that had led to Tokala being thrown down her well. Through Mr. Patterson's translations, she asked Tokala to tell her his people's story, not the simplified version she had learned from her parents, but the real, complicated truth. Tokala spoke for hours over several evenings, describing the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds that had sustained his people for generations, the treaties that had been made and broken repeatedly by the government, the forced relocations to reservations on land that could not support the populations being confined there, and the impossible choice between maintaining their traditional way of life and adapting to a world that seemed determined to erase them. Entirely, Emma listened with tears streaming down her face as she realized the depth of the tragedy she had been blind to. Her parents had not been bad people, but they had accepted the simple narratives that justified the displacement of indigenous peoples, without questioning whether those narratives reflected truth or merely convenience. Emma understood now that the stories of savagery and danger had been exaggerated or invented to make settlers feel better about taking land that did not belong to them, and that the real story was one of communities fighting to survive against overwhelming odds while maintaining their dignity and culture in the face of systematic oppression. The day finally came when word arrived that Tokala's band had been located and arrangements made for his reunion with his family. A trusted guide who worked with the Quakers would escort him to the reservation, traveling openly this time since Tokala was technically registered as heading to his designated location. The joy on Tokala's face when he received this news was so profound that it made Emma's heart ache with happiness for him, but mixed with that joy was clear sadness at having to say goodbye to the people who had saved his life and shown him kindness when he had every reason to expect only cruelty. The farewell took place in the Pattersons' sitting room, with Mr. Patterson translating the more complex thoughts that Tokala wanted to express. He spoke first to Mrs. Fletcher, thanking her for her wisdom and healing knowledge, and presenting her with a small pouch containing seeds for medicinal plants that his people cultivated, along with instructions for their use. To the Pattersons, he gave his solemn word that he would tell his people about their kindness and courage, ensuring that the station would always be considered a place of safety and friendship by his band. But it was his farewell to Emma that carried the most emotional weight. Tokala knelt down to the girl's level, mindful of his still healing leg, and spoke directly to her in a mixture of Lakota and English that Mr. Patterson translated with obvious emotion. He told Emma that she had saved not just his life, but also his faith in the possibility that different peoples could see each other as human beings rather than enemies. He said that her courage in rescuing him despite her own vulnerability, her kindness in caring for him when she had so little for herself, and her willingness to risk everything to protect him, had demonstrated a nobility of spirit that was rare in any person, let alone one so young. Tokala then presented Emma with a gift he had made during his recovery, a small carved figure of a hawk that he had fashioned from a piece of wood using a knife the Pattersons had provided. He explained through translation that in his culture, the hawk was a symbol of vision and courage, of seeing truly rather than accepting what one was told to see, and of having the bravery to act on that vision, even when it meant standing alone. He told Emma that she embodied those qualities, and that she should carry this reminder always as proof of her strength and honor. Emma accepted the carving with trembling hands, her vision blurred by tears as she tried to thank Tokala for his words and gift. But he gently placed a finger on her lips and shook his head, indicating that thanks were not necessary between people who had shared what they had shared. Instead, he made her a promise, speaking slowly so she could understand even without translation. He said that if she ever needed help, if she ever faced danger or hardship that was beyond her ability to handle alone, she should send word to his people and they would come. It was a promise that transcended the usual boundaries of culture and territory, a sacred obligation that Tokala was undertaking not just for himself, but for his entire band. After Tokala departed with his guide, Emma felt an emptiness that surprised her with its intensity. She had known him for less than 2 months, and much of that time he had been too injured to do more than rest and recover. But in that brief period, he had become important to her in ways she was still trying to understand. He had been her first real friend since her parents died, the first person who seemed to truly see her as a whole individual, rather than as a problem to be solved or a child to be managed. His respect for her courage and his acknowledgement of her worth had given Emma a sense of self that would shape the rest of her life. Mrs. Fletcher took Emma to live at her homestead, and over the following months they built the kind of family relationship that is based on choice and mutual affection rather than blood alone. Emma continued her education, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also the broader lessons about justice, compassion, and the importance of questioning accepted narratives. Mrs. Fletcher shared stories from her own life, including the years she had spent among various Native American communities, and Emma began to understand that the world was far larger and more complicated than she had ever imagined from her isolated homestead. Word eventually reached them through the Quaker network that Tokala had been successfully reunited with his family and was recovering fully from his injuries. The message included a note saying that he spoke often of the young girl who had heard his cries and had the courage to pull him from darkness, and that his son was learning the story as one of the important lessons about character and honor. Emma treasured that message, adding it to the small collection of precious items she kept, including the carved hawk that sat on the table beside her bed. As years passed, Emma grew into a young woman who carried the lessons from that transformative summer throughout her life. She became a teacher, working in frontier schools and advocating for educational approaches that respected rather than erased cultural diversity. She maintained connections with the Quaker network and occasionally helped travelers passing through who needed safe harbor or assistance. And she always kept the promise Tokala had made, staying alert for opportunities to offer the same kind of life-saving help to others that she had once provided to a desperate voice calling from the depths of the homestead where Emma had spent her childhood was eventually abandoned, reclaimed by the prairie grass that covered all traces of human habitation with surprising speed. But the well remained, and sometimes travelers would stop there to draw water, never knowing that it had once been the site of a rescue that demonstrated how a single act of courage and compassion could create ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could predict or measure. Emma's story became known in certain circles, told as an example of moral courage overcoming fear and prejudice. But she always insisted that she had not done anything extraordinary, that she had simply responded to a cry for help in the only way that made sense to her conscience. She believed that everyone faced moments where they could choose between looking away from injustice and acting to prevent it, and that those small choices accumulated over a lifetime to define who a person truly was. Emma had made her choice at 12 years old, standing at the edge of a well, and deciding that saving a life mattered more than following the rules that made no sense to her heart. And that choice had set her on a path of service and connection that gave her life meaning and purpose. In the end, the voice from the well had not just been calling for rescue from physical danger. It had been calling Emma to a larger understanding of humanity and her place in it. And she had answered that call with a courage that transformed not just one life, but created a legacy of compassion that would echo through generations, reminding future listeners that true heroism often comes from the smallest hands offering help to the most desperate needs, and that the bonds we choose to honor matter more than the divisions others try to impose.